wider issues, whether they be economic issues, issues related to health and education, but trying to bring everything back to what I consider to be the best practices in community development. One of the reasons that my family and I decided to leave the development industry was because we consider that there was an enormous, uh, I guess you could say, incoherencies in how development projects were carried out. That led to a lot of wasted funds, for one, in terms of economics. Also, a lot of disempowerment of local communities. And so we wanted to be part of a local community, more on a grassroots level, where we could really try and implement some of the best strategies for community development. And today I want to continue that discussion. You can see here, I think my screen is sharing now, that the name of the class this morning is The Metaphor of the Machine. One of the reasons, as I've studied community development and thought about what's the best way, I've come across a lot of very, very interesting authors who I've tried to introduce our students to. And today, two of those authors that were very influential in my own thinking were Lewis Mumford and Jacques Ellul, a French academic and a academic from New York in the United States, both of whom were writing mostly back in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. So, I mean, if we take our kind of a historical lens, that was a time period between the 1940s and 1970s when the whole community or development industry really began to take off, right? So in the post-World War II years was when the major world powers, leading the way, the United States and then later Europe, started to have this kind of development fervor, this desire to go out into the world and to help communities achieve a supposed standard of living. And most people were very on board with that. That was seen as an exciting time, a change from these colonialist tendencies where the world powers used to be militarily involved with other nations. And all of a sudden now you have these development projects trying to help people overcome their poverty. And most people thought of that as very positive. But one of the interesting things was that there were lots of authors, both in developing world and in the developed world, who were very critical of that, and were critical of that because they considered that this development fervor, this desire to bring what we consider progress and development to every corner of the globe, was a kind of a hidden tendency of further imposition of colonialist kind of norms, not necessarily in the colonial sense of a superpower coming and militarily invading a country, but more of trying to impose a way of thought, a way of understanding the world. A way of organizing our economic and cultural lives. And a lot of these really interesting thinkers back in the 1950s, 60s, 70s were saying, we need to think about this. And Lewis Mumford and Jacques Ellul were two of those. And the image that Lewis Mumford used was what he called the machine mentality. And then Ellul played off of that a little bit using a different term we're going to talk about. But today, what I would like to do is introduce you very quickly to the thought, the academic work, and the analysis of Lewis Mumford and Jacques Ellul, their critique of modernity, of the project of modernity. And I wanted to do that because I think that that critique, which they were outlining this back in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, is very, very pertinent today, especially with all the technological developments that we're seeing as a result of modernity, but also because their critique, I think, is also very pertinent to those of us who continue to work in the community development industry. I have a lot of hope. I continue to do consulting work for lots of development organizations, and a lot of times I present these critiques that were outlined by Mumford and Jacques Ellul, and I want to try and share with you all that today. So the outline of the class this morning is that I'm going to first kind of say that I think there's an underlying driver or an underlying cause of all of the crises we face. We're going to explain that. And then I'm going to outline the work of Lewis Mumford and Jacques Ellul. Again, they have a very, very strong critique of this project of modernity, this project of a machine mentality that has been globalized around the world. And then I want to kind of...
If I may interject something real quick, Dr. Roberts.
Yes.
Your program hasn't launched fully to allow us to see the full screen. If you would do that, please.
Is that it?
Carl, there we go. Thank you
Okay.
very much.
No, no, thank you. So yes, after we kind of look at Mumford and Lowell's critique of this project of modernity, this project of creating this machine-like dependence, I want to turn to some hope. And so Ivan Illich is an author that I've shared in several past classes. So I'm going to look at his idea of convivial tools and then try and make a connection to what this critique says about those of us who work in the world of community development. So let's start with the search for an underlying driver of the crises we face. I'm going to ask you all a question. Is there a connection between climate change, biodiversity breakdown, the buildup of toxic chemicals in our bodies and in the ecosystems where we live, increasing inequality, wars, and global violence that fill our screens every day? The loss of social cohesion and a sense of purpose in terms of sociology, and the millions of other crises that have created an unprecedented sense of vulnerability affecting modernity. The question I want to ask is there a connection? Are all of these like all separated kind of issues? Obviously, when we think about where most of the money and the effort and the political effort is being expended is like on climate change. We just had a big a big summit on biodiversity in Colombia last week. Different professionals and individuals might academics might invest their time in how to reduce chemicals in the environment. Other political scientists are working on strategies for reducing conflictivity around the world. But a lot of thinkers look at all of these major issues, right? And they say there is an underlying cause, there is a driver that is kind of pushing all of these things together. And a term that a lot of people have been using is the term metacrisis. You'll see that a lot coming up in these thinkers who are kind of interdisciplinary academics who are saying, look, we need to find what's the underlying cause driving all of these crises that every day, every year get more and more stronger and more worrisome, right? And so the meta crisis is looking at how depleting sources of energy, the problem with carbon buildup due to burning fossil fuels, issues with governance, invasive technologies, financial overshoot, the problem with economic growth, our growing environmental and ecological footprint, all of the issues with war and geopolitical tension, the complexity of our global supply chain teetering on the verge of collapse, the issues of population growth, all of these individual crises, all of these individual problems that we read about in the news are termed this idea as the metacrisis, which is a web of complex, systemic, interconnected, and compounding processes. The metacrises are not isolated issues. It's important to understand that. And because they're not isolated, they cannot be solved independently. I just read a really interesting article by someone who works at the UN who said, look, just last week we had one of the largest biodiversity summits, right? So all of these countries came together and we're thinking about what instruments can be implemented, what sort of governance or global governance instruments can we do to try and rescue the issues of biodiversity, to sustain the natural world. And then in a couple weeks in Azerbaijan, we're going to have the COPE summit, which is about climate change. And the article was saying it's really ridiculous that we have two separate summits. These are interconnected issues, right? The issues of the loss of nature, along with the issues of global climate change. It's that these aren't issues that we can tackle independently. It doesn't mean that there can't be some people scientists that focus more on climate issues and others on nature issues, but the response to that has to be connected, right? The meta crisis, like I mentioned, is the multiple overlapping and interconnected global crises that our nascent planetary culture faces. So if all of these things, right, governance, energy issues, technology issues, economic growth, all of these things are interconnected, what is really this underlying driver? Jonathan Rosen is a UK academic who I used to work with, and he's written an interesting book kind of looking at the issue of metacrisis. And here's what he says. He says, you could say that the metacrisis is the crisis of perception and understanding that lies within the range of crises that humanity faces. So the issue isn't necessarily a technical one. It's not one of a lack of scientific knowledge. He says that the meta crisis is defined by this idea of perception, this kind of cultural understanding of who we are as a species, as humanity, right? But he says the problem is that on the outside, externally, things seem to be getting so much better in so many ways that to talk of meta crisis as if everything is going wrong just doesn't ring true for most people. What's going on, however, is altogether more tragic in the Greek sense of tragicness, right? It's that there is a hidden pattern laced within what's going on that has to do with how things are connected, how they're evolving, how they're coming to a tipping point in which the positive effects will turn negative. And some seem to preserve that more keenly than others. So the meta crisis, again, is this underlying kind of logic of modernity. That even though many things seem to be getting better, GDP is growing, we have ever more powerful technologies, every year humanity as a species is using more energy, more resources, etc. All of these things seem to make life better. But what happens is there's this hidden pattern within everything that is pushing us towards this tipping point, right? This moment when we might, kind of go over the hill and begin our path towards collapse. And he said we have to understand that there is this hidden pattern. So what is this hidden pattern? And I think one of the interesting things, Ivan Illich goes back to kind of Greek mythology. These universal truths that were fleshed out by philosophers thousands of years ago that continue to be pertinent to our world today. And Illich says that that this hidden pattern, this crisis of perception, isn't something that is new. It's something that's always kind of been a part of humanity. And he said it's the issue of hubris, right? Hubris is kind of this term that was coined by the original Greeks back in the mythology, and then picked up by Aristotle and Plato and the other famous Greek philosophers. And hubris is extreme or excessive pride, dangerous overconfidence and complacency, often in combination with arrogance. Arrogance comes from the Latin word adrogare, meaning to feel that one has a right to demand certain attitudes and behaviors from other people and from the natural world, right? So to be arrogant means to claim or seize without justification, to make undue claims, or having to claim or seize without right, to ascribe or attribute without reason. Right. So this underlying driver, this change in perception, this lack of perception, is this idea of humanity and our hubris, our wanting to be as gods, to live as gods. And if we go back even further to the founding of most major religions, in the Old Testament of the Hebrews, there's the history of the Tower of Babel, where humanity wants to build a tower to go up to the heavens and be as gods, and then the gods tear down that. Right? You can't be like us. The Greeks have their own Tower of Babel. There's a Tower of Babel story or similar one in Mayan mythology and Aztec mythology. Most cultures around the world, most religions around the world have this same idea, and it's because there's this almost universal tendency in humanity to want to live as gods, to want to impose our will, to want to live as we do, to live as an arrogant species, a hubristic species, to have overconfidence in ourselves and what we can create. And many authors, and I would agree, say that this human vice of arrogance or hubris is strongest in the modern day kind of conceptualization of how we consider ourselves and our technologies, which are ever more godlike, ever more powerful, right? One of the things that many people fail to think, though, is that in the Greek mythology and in many other religious traditions, hubris always is countered by nemesis, right? So hubris is often paired with the idea of nemesis. Nemesis in Greek mythology was the goddess of vengeance, who punishes those who indulge in hubris, right? So the like Icarus, who wanted to fly, who built wings for himself in Greek mythology so he could fly up to the heavens, and he got too close to the gods, and the sun burned off the glue that he had used to put on the wings, and he fell to his death. But there's always this idea that those who indulge in this tendency, this desire to be as gods, to impose our will, to do everything we want to do, eventually are strucken down by nemesis, right? The consequences of hubris serve as a reminder of human limitations and the dangers of arrogance, right? The myth of the machine, right? This idea that we're going to talk about from Mumford's work is another characterization of that hidden underlying pattern that typifies our hubris and maybe leading us into the outcomes of nemesis. So again, if we go back to this idea of the meta crisis, right? What is that underlying driver of all of these global crises that every time we turn on the news, every time we read, the news online or whatever, it just seems like things are getting harder and harder. First, there's a war between Russia and Ukraine, and then the Middle East, and now Iran and Israel are going to start a regional war, and global climate change is getting worse, and we keep burning more fossil fuels. What is underneath all of this? And it's this idea of wanting to act as gods, is wanting to the human arrogance and hubris, wanting to create a world instead of fitting within it. This is, again, the myth of the machine. So Lewis Mumford, he is not the first one to use this kind of metaphor of the machine, right? There's probably been lots and lots of thinkers. I guess you could even say that even the ancient Greek philosophers, with their idea of hubris and nemesis, kind of had this idea of humanity wanting to impose, their own model for what it is to live well on this earth, and the machine is kind of this idea, because the machine isn't something natural, right? The machine is something fabricated by human hands, by human ingenuity, by human technology, something we control. And Mumford said, look, this is the human history, especially in the last 10,000 years of modernity, of civilization, is the myth of the machine, right? He was an American historian, sociologist, a philosopher of technology. And he says, this is from his book. He wrote a two-part book called The Myth of the Machine. And in the very introduction, he says, this is a quote from the introduction to his book. Our age is passing from the primeval state of man, marked by his invention of tools and weapons for the purpose of achieving mastery over the forces of nature, to a radically different condition, in which he will have not only conquered nature, but detached himself as far as possible from the organic habitat. With this new megatechnics, this new machine mentality, the dominant minority will create a uniform, all-enveloping superplanetary structure designed for automatic operation. Instead of functioning actively as an autonomous personality, man will become a passive, purposeless, machine-conditioned animal whose proper functions, as technicians now interpret man's role, will either be fed into the machine or strictly limited and controlled for the benefit of depersonalized collective organizations. When you hear this kind of introduction to the book, it seems almost kind of sci-fi, futuristic, that we're all going to live in this mega machine. But if we take a long view of history and we look at how powerful our technologies have become, and in order to have any semblance of control over this technological milieu that we've created, we have to have an ever more centralized governance structure, ever more centralized, and this creates this kind of machine mentality that Lewis Mumford was beginning to see. He was writing this back in the 1960s, I think, was when he started this his two-part tome. He also says that this myth of the machine, in the act of conquering nature, our ancestors, past human generations, too often treated the earth as contemptuously and as brutally as they treated its original inhabitants, indigenous populations around the world, wiping out great animal species like the bison. He's referring there to the Native American populations of North America, and the passenger ship, mining the soils instead of annually replenishing them, and even in the present day, invading the last wilderness areas. We acted, he says, under the illusion that the losses of the natural world, the losses of this natural kind of environment that we inherited, this abundant and prosperous earth, that the losses of that, as we created this machine type world, didn't matter, because we always believed, we always hoped that modern man, through science and innovation and our own human ingenuity, would soon fabricate an artificial world infinitely more wonderful than the one that nature had provided. And I think that's the ethos of the machine mentality. That's the path that we're on, right? Of trying to impose more human controllability on the natural world, right? Bring ever more resources into the sphere of our economic lives, control, every aspect. In my passion, which is farming, you look at industrial farming and how what we've tried to do is transform the natural landscape into monocultures of one crop that can be grown with the use of drones and robotics, so that humanity doesn't have to be involved in the process of providing one of life's most important necessities, food, for example, right? The idea is that every sphere of human activity and human life is going to be one that is artificially created, right? That's kind of the machine mentality, as Mumford sees it. Paul Kingsnorth is a modern day author, still writing, and he kind of picked up where Lewis Mumford left off, and he's about to publish a new book, kind of on this modern day telling of the machine type society we're creating. And he says, this is a quote from a recent essay of his: the ultimate project of modernity, Kingsnorth says, is to replace nature with technology and to rebuild the world in purely human shape, the better to fulfill the most ancient human dream, to become as gods. Again, going back to this idea of human hubris, the Tower of Babel, of trying to impose our own reality on the world. What I call the machine, Kingsnorth says, is the nexus, the connections of power, wealth, ideology, and technology that has emerged to make this happen, right? So if we go, Mumford, when he's a historian, in the first part of his two-part books, on the myth of the machine, he looks back and he says, look, the machine mentality started before we even had machines or technologies as we see them today. And he goes back to like the ancient empires. And he says, look at how the Egyptian pharaohs built these massive structures such as pyramids and the Sphinx and all of these great pyramids of the past civilizations. To be able to do that, Mumford said, uh, the ruling class, the nexus of power and wealth and technology, had to conceive of the human population of their as slaves, as interchangeable parts. This idea of seeing society as a machine, started way back in ancient Egypt and past civilizations, right? And what Kingsnorth is saying is that that machine mentality was always latent in human, in our brains, in our cultural conceptions. But now, as that has grown, now everybody is adopting this machine-like mentality, he says. One of the things interesting about Mumford, though, is that he said, despite the fact that this machine mentality is kind of totalitarian, it's always been latent amongst us. We've been trying to create this machine-like society for so many years. Despite that, there's always been something that humanity has fallen back on. And so what he calls that Neolithic village culture, right? This idea of small scale, mostly subsistence type agriculture, small communities living off of the land, providing for their needs as locally and regionally as possible. And he says that one of the things that's interesting about that is that this model of human habitat is one of the most durable aspects of human history, right? Um, Throughout the cyclical rise and fall of civilizations, this Neolithic village culture has maintained itself, and he says, because it did justice to the natural conditions and human capabilities, right? So the empires of the past, whether it be the Mesopotamian empires, the empires of the Mayans, of Roman civilization, all of these rise and fall, rise and fall. But throughout that, there's always this model of small scale human habitation that has existed, right? And Mumford says that this economy, this Neolithic village cultural economy, as long as it remained on a fairly subsistence level with a sufficient holdover of food to ensure against the unexpected, was self-regulating, self-maintaining. Its motto was enough is plenty, right? And this idea of enoughness, of having enough, is the exact opposite of the machine mentality, right? And one of the things that's again, going back to this durability of this alternative, this antithesis to the machine mentality. This is a picture of the Hoya del Seren. It's an archaeological monument here in El Salvador, where I live. It's kind of like the Pompeii of the Mayan world. There was a huge volcanic explosion in about 600 AD. And it essentially buried this small Mayan village. And it's the only place in the Mayan world, in the ancient Mayan kingdom, where you can see how the ordinary people lived, right? All of the pyramids and the really like nice archaeological structures. That's how the wealthy lived. That's an example of how this nexus of power and ideology that Kingsnorth was talking about. That's the machine mentality. But the antithesis of the machine mentality is what you see in this buried village where the volcanic ash preserved basic traditional Neolithic village life. And one of the things that's fascinating as you walk through this, you see a type of lifestyle, a cultural manifestation that is almost exactly like what it's like to live in rural areas in El Salvador today. The same type of construction, the same type of agriculture, the same, even like certain kind of like cultural expressions and festivals. These things that existed in 680 in El Salvador continue to exist today because it makes sense. There's a sort of commonsensical aspect of this philosophy of having enough, right? Um, to end with Mumford, he said that this idea of the Neolithic village culture, today is starting to die out with this universalization of this machine-like mentality. But he said that he wrote kind of his final essay before he died was talking about what he called a biotechnic society, which is kind of like how do we actualize, how do we bring into modernity this kind of response to the machine mentality to go back to the proper scale of living well. And he says that the biotechnic society would not hold to this mega technic delusion, this machine-like mentality that hope that technology must expand unceasingly, magnifying ever more power. Um, and that we would have to shatter that delusion in order to create and preserve what he called a livable society. Rather than this machine like megatechnic pursuit of power, a biotechnic society would pursue what he called plenitude, right? Enoughness, having enough but not wanting ever more. That is a sort of homeostatic relationship between resources and needs. This notion of plenitude becomes clear if we suggest that the biotechnic society would relate to its technology in the same manner that an animal relates to available food. Animals don't get fat, which is interesting. Most animals, right? In a natural situation, animals are not going to continue to eat until they're oversatiated, right? Most animals in the animal world, under circumstances of natural satisfaction, the pursuit of technological advance would not simply continue for its own sake, right? So, along the limiting effect of satisfaction amidst plenitude, the pursuit of technological advance would also be limited by its potentially negative effects upon the organism. So, Mumford was arguing just as an animal will eat what it needs and not more, this idea of a biotechnic society would learn to question this idea of the machine mentality, right? Of wanting to impose ever more of our order. And we would kind of arrest this tendency towards arrogance and human hubris by understanding enoughness, right? By understanding what's good for the livability of the world in which we live. So that's kind of a really quick introduction to Lewis Mumford and his work. If anybody's interested, I would say definitely to check out his two-part book series called The Myth of the Machine, where he goes into really historical depths about how this machine mentality started and what are some of the manifestations of that today. Another thinker that I think was a contemporary writer and academic and thinker, philosopher of Mumford was the French philosopher, sociologist, theologian, and professor called Jacques Ellul. And Ellul kind of picked up on or followed along kind of this machine-like metaphor, but he used a word which he calls technique. And technique in English doesn't really make a huge amount of sense. He was very committed to maintaining the French word, which is la technique. But it's this idea. So what does he mean by technique? And Ellul says that technique is the totality of methods rationally arrived at and having absolute efficiency for any given stage of human development in every field of human activity. And so he said it's kind of technique Alol's idea or conceptualization of technique is kind of the motor driving the machine mentality. Again, it's this underlying driver that we talked about, this hidden kind of manifestation that Jonathan Rosen was talking about. That's kind of that's pushing the meta crisis in which we live. And Alol says that the machine mentality, this myth of the machine, has its own rationality, right? There's a reason that humanity continues to pursue economic growth, to pursue more energy and resource use, to pursue ever more kind of bringing the natural world into this artificial creation of our own hands, right? And it's because it makes sense. It's this rationality of the machine. It's the machine mentality that has come to dominate humanity, right? The term technique, he says, is not solely related to machines or technologies, but rather to the procedures used to attain an end, the underlying ethos of civilization given over completely to this end. Elo, his most famous book is called The Technological Society, where he outlines kind of how technique is overcoming humanity. He says he proposes different characteristics of modern technology that make this goal of efficiency almost kind of like a godlike thing, making everything efficient, making everything easy, making everything comfortable. Right, this modern kind of infatuation that we have with wanting life to be easy, to be straightforward, to be kind of manicured, to have everything brought under our control where we know exactly what's going to happen. This is, again, the kind of the underlying driver of the machine mentality that Mumford was talking about. And so he talked about the rationality of these decisions, the creation of artificial spaces, artificial human milieu was the word that he used, the automatism of technical choice, self-augmentation. He was already looking at, all of these issues around bioethics and gene editing, and all of these things that are just around the corner in terms of the new technologies we're creating, the ability to even create artificiality in how we create humans. There's a lot of discussion about gene editing and how we can create superhumans on a genetic level. All of this gets along to this idea of technique, of this machine mentality. The rationality of technique, Ellul says, enforces logical and mechanical organization through division of labor, the setting of production standards, etc. And it creates an artificial system which eliminates or subordinates the natural world. The idea of the machine mentality is to eventually create a planet where every aspect of human activity is under our own control. Again, and what is a more kind of pertinent example of human hubris than that, right? Again, another quote from his book called The Technological Society is that modern technology has become a total phenomenon for civilization, the defining force of a new social order in which efficiency is no longer an option, but a necessity imposed on all of human activity. Here's a few more quotes. His book is fascinating if you're interested in learning more about this idea of technique. But here's just two quick quotes. He says, technique has penetrated the deepest recesses of the human being. The machine, again, he uses the same kind of metaphor as Mumford, tends not only to create a new human environment, but also to modify man's very essence. The milieu or the environment in which he lives is no longer his. We must adapt as though the world were new to a universe for which we were not created. For example, we were made to go 6 kilometers an hour as a biological species, he says, and now we go 1,000. We were made to eat when we were hungry and to sleep when we were tired. Instead, we obey a clock, through this kind of modern day global economy in which we live. We were made to have contact with living things, and today we live in a world of stone created by our own hands, a world of steel and plastic and all of these things. We were created with a certain essential unity, and today we are fragmented by all the forces of the modern world. The world that is being created by the accumulation of technical means is an artificial world and hence radically different from the natural world in which our species evolved. A lot of authors talk about this kind of this break or this rupture with our evolutionary heritage. Humanity has evolved over millions and millions of years, and only within the last couple generations have we broken this environment in which we've come to thrive, right? This technical world, this technique destroys, eliminates, subordinates the natural world, and does not allow the world to restore itself or even to enter into a symbiotic relationship with it. The two worlds obey different imperatives, different directives, different laws, which have nothing in common, he says. And so Alol is obviously he's a very dreary writer. He doesn't see a lot of hope. But he says the stage in which the human being was a mere slave of the mechanical tyrant has been passed. When man himself becomes a machine, when the human being becomes a machine, we attain to the marvelous freedom of unconsciousness, the freedom of the machine itself. And that's where Alol says we've come today, right? This idea of technique has taken over every aspect of our civilization, from birth to death. Everything is submitted to the technical efficiency and systematization. Our lives are governed by the tools, by the machines, by the technologies we've created, right? This old dream of tempting man from that has tempted us from beginning, right? This dream of hubris, of human arrogance, of wanting to impose order, of creating our own artificial world. He goes back to this medieval legend of the man who sells his soul for an inexhaustible purse of wealth. This recurs with an enticing insistence through all the changes of civilization, as perhaps in process of being realized. But today, this machine-like existence, this hubris, isn't just available to the kings and the pharaohs of the old, but it's available to all of us today, right? Through the technologies that we've created, through this technological environment that is being propagated. This is where what we're at. And Alol doesn't have a lot. He doesn't see how we can escape this kind of totalitarian effect of the machine mentality, right? Fortunately, there are other thinkers who are a bit more hopeful. In Ivan Illich, who's a thinker, a philosopher, a sociologist that I've referred to in the past, he has a really interesting kind of response to how we can kind of reinstall a sense of human purpose, a sense of human autonomy, especially in this machine-like world in which we live. How do we overcome what Alol calls this technique, this seeking after ever greater technological efficiency, ever greater comfort and ease and controllability of the world? And Illich says that as the power of machines increases, people tend to become nothing more than consumers, right? We're relegated to this. We in the past, my great grandfather, my grandfather built their own homes, grew their own food, sourced their own water, participated in the governance of their own lives through participating in local councils and local decision-making purposes. Today is the election in the United States. Most people might our political participation has been reduced to voting every 4 years, if we even do that. And there's probably going to be about a 50% voter turnout in the United States today. So political participation is gone. We're no longer politically involved. We're no longer involved in producing the necessities. What we are cogs in the machine, which says we're nothing more than consumers. And that's because of this encroachment of the machine mentality, right? But Illich says that he wrote a really interesting book called Tools for Conviviality. And he said that, look, human beings have always used tools. That's kind of our ecological niche. That's what sets us apart as a biological species, is our ability to manipulate the world around us. But what types of tools we use and create is extremely important, right? And he said that we can stop this tendency towards ever more totalitarian machine-like tools that dominate ourselves. And he says we need to think about the criteria by which the manipulation of people for the sake of their tools can be immediately recognized, right? When are the tools that we depend upon no longer support our lives, but become that enslave us, right? And thus to exclude those artifacts and institutions which inevitably extinguish a convivial lifestyle. He differentiated between convivial tools and what he called industrial tools, totalitarian tools that tried to enslave people to this machine-like mentality, and tools that really created that existed to help people live well. Mumford would say the tools that enabled a well-being in this kind of Neolithic village culture that existed throughout humanity. There were things that people used that made life easier, but allowed them to maintain a sense of control and autonomy, that allowed them to really interact with life and be free and have an ability to live well. Illich says that the present world today is divided into those who do not have enough and those who have more than enough. And part of that is because there are tools which can be used normally for fully satisfying, imaginative, and independent work. Other tools, however, tend to be used primarily in activities best labeled as labor, right? And then there are also tools that can only be operated by machines. Illich says that convivial tools are those that give each person who uses them the greatest opportunity to enrich the environment with the fruits of his or her own vision. And I think that's important, right? The ability that's kind of the essence of humanity, right? Of being able to enrich this world with our own gifts, with what we've been given, right? And I think it's fairly easy to see that a lot of modern day tools and technologies are not about that. They're about enslaving people. Every time we turn on our social media, our Facebook and our Instagram, we're bombarded, with algorithmic images and text that are trying to get us to buy something. They're trying to control us. They're trying to mine our data. That has nothing to do. This type of tool has nothing to do with enabling us to really to make our mark on the world, right? So what Illich called industrial tools deny this possibility to those who use them, and they allow the designers to determine the meaning and expectations of others. Most tools today cannot be used in a convivial fashion. That we're subject to those who create these, especially when we talk about all of the smart technologies, smartphones, computers. Ever more we're being subjected to a vision of the world that's being imposed upon us, right? And lastly, here's another quote from his book, Tools of Conviviality. Illich says that certain tools are destructive no matter who owns them, whether it be the mafia, stockholders, a foreign company, the state, or even a workers' commune, right? Networks of multi-lane highways, long-range, wide bandwidth transmitters, strip mines, compulsory school systems. All of these are examples of tools that cannot be convivial. Destructive tools must inevitably increase regimentation, dependence, exploitation, impotence, and rob not only the rich, but also the poor of conviviality, which is the primary treasure in so many undeveloped areas. So Illich says what we need to do is learn to differentiate between those tools and technologies that enable human autonomy, that increase our ability to live well under our own purposes, under our own ideas of what it means to live well on this earth, right? I'm going to finish here real quick so we can have some time for questions and comments at the end. But again, what does all of this have to do with the world of community development? What is the meta crisis, the underlying drivers, the idea, this kind of idea of human hubris is kind of this original issue that invades us. The thought of the machine mentality, as Mumford defined it, the issue of technique is defined by a lull in this invitation to find tools that really enable human autonomy and human flourishing instead of enslaving us and having us be directed by the industrial lords of the world we live in. What does this have to do with development? And I'm going to say this is kind of my treatise on what good development practices are about. And I think it's important to understand that the machine mentality and the ethos of technique is inherently unstable, right? It's vulnerable to crises and to collapse. It's historically violent, colonialist, hegemonic, especially towards people who live in rural areas, and it's obviously ecocidal, right? So I think it's important that if we look at the meta crisis, all of these things that are spiraling out of our control, it's interesting. Humanity has wanted to control ever more of the world, and in our quest to do that, we're losing control of the most basic things. A stable climate to live in, topsoil to grow our food in, clean water to drink, these basic elements for human survivability. We're losing the control of this because of our desire to control. And so this machine mentality is pushing us into a situation, I would say, of extreme vulnerability, right? Despite that, these characteristics of modernity are masked by apparent temporary gain, affluence. Things seem to be getting better. And one of the things that I see as a problem is here in El Salvador, where I live, and in many parts of the developing world around the world, people are enamored with this kind of like machine like mentality, and everybody, people in rural areas are migrating in millions of people around the world into urban areas, into these urban slums, migrating and risking their lives to migrate to the United States, to Europe, to other parts of the developed world, because they have this idea that this machine-like affluence is what everybody needs to conquer, right? And everything seems to be getting better. Everything's, we have this hope that we're going to continue this onward march of progress, which is kind of this myth of modernity, right? However, I would say that the best develop those of us who continue to work in the development industry, the best development practices are those done by organizations, by individuals, by communities, who have the ability to see the hidden patterns, right? That are on this underlying motor of the meta crisis, right? That see that this drive to modernity, to want to control and impose, to have more economic growth, to increase our technological strength. All of these issues are things that are extremely vulnerable, extremely dangerous. It's kind of the remaking of this modern myth of the machine mentality, the hubris as expressed by the ancient Greeks, right? And we need to see these hidden patterns and create proposals for development that liberate communities from the myth of the machine and the domination of technique. How do we do this? One, I think it starts by recognizing what has worked historically. I don't think it's just about romanticizing the past, saying that indigenous peoples or rural-based peoples or our ancestors had everything perfect, right? This Mumford kind of was accused of romanticizing what he called, this Neolithic village culture. Obviously, there were problems, right? But one of the things that's important is not just to say that just because there were problems in the past, we have to overcome that. We have to go beyond. We have to march forward. No, we need to start by looking what has worked, right? In every region, what are some of the aspects of historic livelihood? If we go back again, why is it that the archaeological site here in El Salvador that I mentioned called Joya de Seren. Why is it that there's such a connection, a visual connection to how people lived in 600 AD and how people continue to live in the rural countryside of El Salvador today? There's a reason for that continuity, and it's because people developed lifeways and cultural practices and agricultural techniques that worked in the place where they lived. We need to look at that and see, what were these patterns that worked for so long, right? And how can we recognize that, right? How can we value that? So that's one. I think it starts by looking at what has worked historically, and in every region, in every community, it's going to be different, right? Obviously, what worked in one part of the world is going to be very different than another part of the world, but there's wisdom in how people adapted to their places. Secondly, I think it's about strengthening alternative epistemologies, right? Questioning this machine-like mentality, this kind of Western paradigm of economic growth, of development, of progress, right? There are other ways of understanding the world. And here in Latin America, we talk a lot about buen vivir, which is the idea, this indigenous conceptualization of what it means to live the good life. That the good life is not about accumulation, about dominating nature, about having more, but about living well in your place, having enough, right? Going back to this idea of enoughness, which is kind of this philosophical antithesis to the machine-like mentality. Second and thirdly, incorporating convivial tools, right? Just because something worked in the past doesn't mean we can't incorporate new technologies, new ideas, new strategies. No, of course. Good development work is about doing that, but it's not about just adopting technologies, right? Just because the newest iPhone hit the market doesn't mean we have to buy it, right? Just because certain technologies are released doesn't mean we have to all of a sudden start using that. Good development practices are about looking about what tools, what technologies can be really focused on this idea of conviviality, of living well with what we have. And lastly, in all of the development projects, understand that the creation of an artificial world is not what we should be opting for. We should be helping communities to understand how they can live in right ecological balances with the places where they live. That those are kind of my four, uh, I would say, best practices, or maybe not even practices, the best kind of values or the ethos that should guide the best development work. I hope that I haven't gone over too long. We have about 5 or